We're happy today to be joined by Paul Rees, the biographer of John Mellencamp. His new biography, simply titled Mellencamp, comes out on Tuesday, September 14th in the United States. And I believe, Paul, it comes out on Monday, September 20th in Europe, which is where you're located. And I guess I just wanted to start by asking, how did this entire project come to fruition? I know you've written articles about John Mellencamp in the past for magazines, but what made you decide to write a full-on biography?
Well, first of all, obviously been a fan. I've been a long-standing fan, but then I interviewed John at some length on two occasions. I think 2010, 2014, if memory serves off the top of my head. But he's just a fascinating character. He's one of those characters when he is like a character at Faulkner or something like that. And the story just seems so rich and interesting. He was so vivid a character that it just seemed an obvious thing to do. And it took a few years to get round to doing it, but it worked out fine in the end.
And this biography is just fantastic. I mean, it's really like the career-spanning documentary that Mellencamp fans have wanted for many years, but it's never occurred yet, and maybe it still will. It's kind of like the written version of that. You have so many voices in and out of this book. You talk to ex-bandmates, engineers. His daughter Justice is quoted heavily throughout this book. A lot of friends and acquaintances. Obviously, this was a authorized biography. Can you kind of talk about how the process went in selecting your interview subjects?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those weird ways. It's not officially authorized. I mean, it doesn't, but it was done.
But his management team did assist you with this, right? You thanked Randy Hoffman and Sharon in the back of the book. I know Sharon very well, very nice lady. Yeah. So obviously his management team was helping you with this, so it had to be on some level authorized, right?
Yeah, I mean, that John knew what I was doing. Randy was very helpful. Randy sort of did clear the way and fix up pretty much all of the interviews in the book. So yeah, they knew what was going on all the way through that, and he knew what was going on. They've supplied all the photographs of the book, so that there's a lot of pictures that John's dad sorted out for us. So there's family photos and in the final version of the book. So yeah, it was a process that was it was made a hell of a lot easier by having that involvement.
So when it came to selecting interview subjects, was there anybody you told you couldn't talk to? Did you want to talk to, an ex-wife or an ex-bandmate that maybe had a contentious departure from the band and they were like, no, we don't want you to talk to him? Or how did that process work?
There might have been one or two, Mike. There might have been one or two. I think it's like anything else. I drew up a huge wish list, which probably included everybody that anybody knows anything about John would want to talk to. And for one reason, I think in terms of family members, I think I'd have obviously liked to talk to Hood and Speck. I don't think they didn't want to, so obviously that's just something. I spoke to Justice and Teddy Joe. Justice at great length and Teddy Joe, but I spoke to Joe, John's half brother, at some length as well. I'd like to have spoken to Richard Mellencamp as well, but Richard's obviously in his 90s. I think he's probably got better things to do than spend several hours on the phone. Right. But yeah, I think that the most important thing was wanting to get a broad picture of John, both from family members, from people who knew him, from people who worked with him, people who'd recorded him and collaborated with him. And I think as far as can be done, I managed to do that.
Oh, you absolutely did. And there are some quotes from John in the book. I get the sense that those were from your previous interviews from 2010 and 2014. You had two chapters devoted to your meetings with him in 2010, August of 2010 and September of 2014, when No Better Than This and Plain Spoken were released. But I get the sense you didn't talk to John specifically for this project. Is that accurate?
That's accurate, yeah. I mean, I obviously I would have liked to have had another chat with John. He felt, I mean, as I said, I'd spoken to him at length on two occasions. So both the interviews with him are drawn from that point and from those interviews. He's looked it over, so he knows what's in the book as well. So there's no surprises lurking for it.
Right, but I guess he just didn't want to be interviewed for this. He just use your past stuff, and that's fine. But I don't want to participate in any new quotes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, as you'll know, he's working on a new record. He's got music and all that sort of stuff going on. I think he's one of those guys who I think on two reasons. I think he's very much looked forward. I don't think he's particularly keen on looking back. And obviously, if he ever decides to do it himself and sit down and do his own autobiography, he's kept the powder dry on that front as well.
That's right. And so that's the other thing that's interesting. So you say John read over. I was going to ask that question. If John had read this manuscript before it got published, and it sounds like he signed off on everything that's in the book. And there are some things in this book that are very harsh and don't necessarily cast John in the most positive light. And I was curious if obviously he had no issues with that stuff going to print, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have to pay him the highest credit for that, because yes, he did read. I did him the courtesy. I sent him the manuscript. He read the manuscript. The only thing he pointed out a couple of things that were dates. I think I got the name of the street. I'd taken down the name of the street where his grandmother Laura lived. I'd taken that down wrong, and he pointed out that. But there was pretty much nothing else that he asked to be changed. I'm sure he's not particularly, I'm sure he's not turning circles at some of the descriptions of him.
Right.
But I mean, from the start, Randy Hoffman was pretty clear from the start that they were fully aware if it was going to be done, that people would express opinions of John that he might not agree with, or he might not be comfortable with, but they wouldn't ask for those things to be changed, and they didn't.
Well, yeah, if we can get into that a little bit, I don't want to spoil the book for everybody, but we'll touch on a few highlights. There's obviously, I guess some fairly harsh mistreatment of band members. I know Pat Peterson, I think the way you quoted it is during the making of Lonesome Jubilee. He quoted, he once cussed Pat Peterson this way and that, I think is the way you wrote it. And during those same sessions, he put Toby Myers in a headlock because he'd made a joke about Rudy Toot Toot, the last song on the album. And then we get into the 90s, and in the making of the 1998 self-titled album, he actually punched, or in some semblance physically assaulted, Andy York over a comment he made about passing chords in the song Your Life Is Now. So some pretty harsh things that I think might take some fans aback. I mean, I'm as hardcore a fan as you're going to find. I've never heard these stories. So you unearthed some great stuff in this book. And do you think there's fans that are going to come away from this thinking, whoa, I didn't know this about John. Maybe I'm not a fan of him anymore. I mean, is there any thought of that? Or, at the end of the day, the art's all that matters, and the art's fantastic.
I think everybody probably, most people know that John's driven.
Yes.
And I think if you are a fan, the distance that he came from those early records through to Scarecrow, and then on past that he's traveled as an artist, I think there's obviously got to be something intensely driven about him. And I think that's, he's in charge of what he does, and that manifests itself in the way, I don't think he's ever made any secret of the fact he's quite demanding, to put it mildly. Little Bastard as a name probably gives you some indication of the way he operates in the studio. And I think at the end of that, I think it's very hard. I think because I spoke to Andy York, obviously, who's still playing with John. Andy York's opinion of the incident when John, I think some people said slap, some people said punch, some people said... Andy was like, these things happen all the time. That's just... and Andy's still playing with John. I think people who've left bands, who aren't in bands anymore, tend to have a different view of the situation. Obviously, some people take exceptions to things. I think at the end of the day, it's John's name above the door. And the ultimate responsibility for everything rests with John. And I think, people carried on playing with him for album after album after album, I think. And I don't know whether, I think artists are intensely focused and intensely driven. I think probably if you speak about any of these guys, if you speak about Springsteen, if you speak about Petty, you'll probably find they're all demanding in their own ways. They get what they want, and the reason they've sustained careers for that length of time is because they do it their way.
Right. Yeah, and it sounded even with some of the subsequent quotes following up that Andy York incident in '98, it sounded like that might have been the trigger point for Toby Myers to leave the band. He left right after that album, and he kind of indicated in some of the quotes you had that might have been the tipping point for him to leave, even though I know he was having a son and he said he had plenty of money. It sounded like that incident could have pushed him over the edge a little bit.
Yeah, I think for Toby, I think that the way expressed to me was, he felt he was comfortably off he was about to have a son, and I think probably he'd had several years of working in an environment which was testing, and I think he probably fancied a break.
Yeah.
I think he also, Toby also said he was hoping once he'd left, he then also did hope and expect that he might get a call to come back, and a call that never came. So
Yeah.
I don't think Toby saw his leaving as necessarily forevermore. I think John did, though.
Right. And I think Toby did come back and do a little bit of work on Trouble No More, but there was a quote in there where he said he thought when his son turned 15, John would call him to come back, but that call never came. So I think John's pretty set with the band he has. Now, obviously, people who are fans of the 80s band, the 80s iteration of John's band, are very familiar with Larry Crane and his involvement from the beginning of John's career right on through I guess really through Big Daddy and the Falling from Grace movie, which he starred in. And then right when they were going to make Whenever We Wanted, there was an incident where John was going to hand out $1 million checks to everybody in the band for all the great work they had done. And, this story, every time it gets told, there's an article in the Indianapolis Star in 1999 where John said he handed the $1 million checks, and Larry threw it down and said, "I don't want it. I want 2 million." There was in Larry's own book, he said that that they, he just kind of really couched it, and that the amount turned out not to be that much. The way you kind of couched it was that the $1 million checks were only like 660,000 after taxes, and that they wanted $1 million even after taxes. And so this led to Larry's departure from the band. By all accounts, they had never spoken after this incident occurred. David Grissom was hired to replace him on guitar for 2 albums, and then ultimately, as you mentioned, Andy York came on for Dance Naked and is still there to this day. There was a great part of the story where at John's brother's Ted's funeral in March of 2016, he put his arms around Larry and let water flow under the bridge, as you put it. Do you have any further insights into their reconciliation? Was it just that one day? Have they spoken since then, or was that just like a one-off? It lifted me up a little bit just to hear that they finally connected after all of this time of estrangement.
As far as I'm aware, and I don't know, as far as I'm aware, that was the one encounter. I think Larry had gone along to pay his respects. I think that was the last time that there was any real or meaningful contact between the two of them, but I don't know for sure. I do know that the conversation about the checks, I spoke to 3 different people who were in the room when the infamous meeting occurred. So I think and they all were broadly agreed with what had happened and the way that it had gone down. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, there's been I don't think they're exchanging Christmas cards, and I don't think they're on the phone to each other. I think that was probably the last meeting that they had.
So the account that you had on that infamous meeting, just to kind of frame this up, from all accounts, it was like a meeting he had before they were going to record Whenever We Wanted, just to kind of outline plans for the next album and tour. And they met in the control room at the Belmont Mall studio, John's recording studio. John handed out the checks. Larry apparently didn't want his check, and according to John, at least, he threw the check down and said he wanted 2 million, and John pretty much fired the whole band and then ultimately invited them all back, but Larry never came back. So the story you got was that he handed out the checks, but they all agreed that they wanted $1 million after taxes, not before taxes, correct?
Yeah, and I think Larry was either elected or delegated himself the spokesman to say they wanted it. And I think from all accounts, John just went, "Fine, you're all fired." I think they let the dust settle for a couple of weeks. I think Toby Myers talks about he'd gone out to John was out in Hollywood, and Larry had spoken to John's father Richard, and he'd said let it cool down. Then Toby gone to see John out in Hollywood, and it had all blown over by that point. But Larry was the only one who didn't come back. I think Larry actually stepping up and disagreeing was pretty much sealed his exit. Yeah,
and so I bring this up because there was a great quote you had from John in this book around the Lonesome Jubilee era, the Lonesome Jubilee tour, where John said, "We were the best band in the world at that time. I don't care who you care to mention, the Rolling Stones, U2, we were better." And I think that's going to, draw a lot of rock fans who are maybe a fan of Springsteen and the E Street Band or Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers are going to be like, whoa, you're saying you're better than those guys. But a lot of people share John's sentiment there that he had the best band on the planet. I know Toby Myers has said that several times during that Scarecrow Lonesome Jubilee era.
Well, I think that's one of the, certainly from this, it's a slightly different perspective, I think, from this side of the pond. I think John has been really underrated on this side of the pond. I think you look at Springsteen, Petty, who you mentioned, obviously both great, obviously both had great bands. But I always think, I approached this book from the view that John was on the level with those guys, both as a songwriter and as a performer. And that band was a fabulous band. I mean, there's no doubt at all that was a great, great band. And lots of people I spoke to in connection with the book, and you talk about, they were unbelievably well drilled. I mean, the rehearsals, people liken the rehearsals to things like, they were like sports teams in training. And lots of people who saw them were how great they were. They were a phenomenal band. I remember being in the States around the time of the Scarecrow tour and driving around America at that point and listening to American radio. And it was very much, this is the tour you have to catch. This is the band you have to catch. So I don't think there's any doubt. I don't think the E Street Band, obviously a phenomenal band. Tom Petty's band, the Heartbreakers, a great band. But I think at a certain point, definitely, they were right up there with them.
Yeah, and the Scarecrow tour, Lonesome Jubilee tour, those are the two kind of holy grail tours for fans, and we're hoping that someday an official show from those tours gets released, with pristine audio or video. That hasn't happened yet, but hopefully that's somewhere down the line. Do you have any recollections? How many shows did you see on the Scarecrow tour? Did you go to several?
Well, that's because he just didn't come here. He just did not come to the UK. So, the first time I saw John would have been, if I'm right in saying it's Whenever We Want. It was the first time he actually made. Yeah, that's the first time he made it over here. And I saw a couple of shows on that tour. And then I've since then I saw him out on the Dylan tour, and he did a little club show over in London. But that's always been one of the great frustrations if you're a Mellencamp fan from the UK, that he just didn't travel here. He didn't bring those tours over here.
Yeah, he really didn't tour outside of the United States from the Whatever We Wanted tour all the way to the Life, Death, Love, and Freedom tour period of 16 years. He pretty much just toured US and Canada and didn't really leave the United States. I think he did a few press things over in Europe, but never really any full-fledged shows. So I think, his popularity outside of the United States isn't what a Tom Petty or a Bruce Springsteen or a Billy Joel or any of those guys would be able to claim, because he really just hasn't worked those markets in the live venues. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think from a UK perspective, John, I don't think there's any comprehension of what John's done pretty much since Whenever We Wanted a push, but possibly since Big Daddy. I think he's the idea of where John's gone with his career and what he's doing now. I think he's, in a lot of senses in the UK, he's seen as this guy a guy from the 80s. And I think that was one of the things of the book, that, he's gone on and made, he's had a terrific run of records in the last 10, 15 years. I think some of the best records he's made, but there's very little appreciation of that in the UK.
Yeah, from Freedom's Road really on through Sad Clowns and Hillbillies, which I know you thought was a little ragged and maybe strung together. I really enjoyed that record. And then now there's this new one coming out. Springsteen said, who sings on the album, says it'll be out in the fall, and it's called Strictly a One-Eyed Jack. So we'll see if that release time still happens. And it sounds like it's all brand new songs John's written, and it should be fantastic if his last few records are any indication. So we'll see what that ends up sounding like. But I wanted to talk about the music a little bit because I definitely think that you're a very astute musical observer. I love the descriptions you have of the songs and the albums in this book. I guess there's two things that me as a hardcore fan, there was two things that, and I know a lot of people share the sentiment you put through in here, but you were a little harsh on Whenever We Wanted and Cut Heads. I love both of those records. I think that they're underrated in John's catalog. I know that there was a lot of band infighting during both of those. The Larry Crane thing that we just mentioned about Whenever We Wanted, and you mentioned that Andy York was quoted in here as saying that the Cutting Heads period was a dark period for the band. I love both that record and the tour that followed. So they were able to mask it from me. The tour I thought was very, very creative, opening with Gimme Shelter and, the solo acoustic version of the song Women's Seam that he played at every show. And there was a great version of Full Catastrophe from Mr. Happy Go Lucky that was in that tour. And then just the album itself, I thought Deep Blue Heart was a very nice song. Peaceful World. I guess I'm, In Our Lives was the last song, Just Like You. I thought that there were some really great songs on that record. I guess I'm just curious your thoughts of where, if you could expound a little more now that we're out of the book formatted into a live conversation of where those records fell short.
I think whenever we want to, I think because I think that where it fell in the context of what he's doing, I felt it was a little bit one-dimensional. I think he'd gone with Big Daddy and then Human Wheels and those. He'd gone somewhere really, really interesting and rich and varied. And I think it was a bit one-dimensional. And I love certain songs. I think Melting Pot's a great song. I love Love and Happiness. But I think there's 3 or 4 songs on that record that I would call filler in the standards of what John was up to. Cutting Heads, I think I tried to express, but I think there's some great songs. I think Peaceful Word's a great song. I love Peaceful Word as a song. But I just, personally speaking as a fan, I think there's a couple of songs on that record where it's John trying to be a pop star still, or still trying to have hits.
That was his last attempt at that,
yeah. And I think he got that out of his system. And I think the record that followed that is I think Freedom's Road's a brilliant record, just a brilliant record. And I think he probably needed to make Cutting Heads to get where he's gone since then. But it really there's just one or two and 1 or 2 songs again on John Mellencamp, the self-titled record, that I skip or tend to want to skip, and I don't do that a lot on John's records.
Right. Yeah. That was another one, the self-titled record. And I guess just John's own perception. So your perception of Whenever We Wanted, John agrees with. He's been very harsh on that record in interviews over the last 20 plus years. If he even mentions it at all, he'll say that, that record was not any good. And there was I think an American Songwriter, there was a feature after Sad Clowns and Hillbillies came out where he said, I don't even remember making Whenever We Wanted and Dance Naked. So, and he's dismissed really all of his 90s albums with maybe the exception of Human Wheels in several interviews. So John's own vision of his work isn't, particularly in the 90s. I think in the 2014 article, you said that it was just kind of an assembly line to keep the gravy train rolling, that the albums weren't, I guess maybe not as creative or as well thought out as his 80s records were, and really everything from Freedom's Road onward. What sense do you get? Because I know Mike Wanchek said that he thinks on the self-titled record, there's some wonderful things on it. He said that, and you had quoted him as saying that in the book. Do others share the vision that John has of his 90s work, or are others more positive about it?
I think John's his harshest critic, which again, I think explains why he's had such a long sustaining career. He's harder on himself than anybody else is. I think you tend to talk to the musicians who played on those records, the engineers, the people who worked on those records, and that's how difficult they were, but they tend to like them. I think certainly John's perception of those records when he talks to you is that I coasted through them. You talk to the musicians who played on them, the engineers who worked on them, and they give you anything but that impression. The idea that he punched in and punched out, he just doesn't do that. And I think, they were tense, difficult records because he was dead set on making a certain kind of record. He certainly wasn't coasting. I think with the 2 Columbia records, the sense I got was that Columbia signed him in the wake of Carlos Santana having a massive, great record. Is it Supernatural, the album that Carlos Santana had? And the idea that, for want of a better term, these heritage artists could have multi-million selling records again. And I think they expected a certain kind of record from John that John wasn't necessarily mindful of delivering, or didn't want to deliver that kind of record. And I think they ended up as perhaps uncomfortable compromises as a result of that in certain respects. And I think that's probably the issue for him and for the records in those 2 Columbia records. I think the 90s, I just get the sense I think John probably, in a sense, in the 90s, although he won't admit it, wanted to still be having massive radio hits and wasn't, because at a certain age radio moves on. That's just the natural way of things. And I think his frustration with those records, certainly definitely with Human Wheels, was that he expected it to be a bigger selling record than it was, and he found it quite difficult to find a broader audience for that record.
Right. Yeah, and I know he had expressed a lot of disappointment in the song Human Wheels itself, that the record company could only get it to 48, and he thought it was the best song he'd ever written, and that was one he wrote with George Green. When you talk about those 90s records, you're very right. I mean, John doesn't coast through anything. I almost think he just kind of retroactively tries to say that because maybe those albums weren't heralded, they weren't huge commercial successes, so he just, through the mist of time, tries to pretend like, oh, I really wasn't there for those records. But I'm pretty sure in the actual making of them and some of the band, I mean, Andy had indicated that the whole incident where we had talked about with the slap or the punch on the Life Is Now was because he was under enormous pressure from Columbia to deliver a huge hit record. The kind of the backstory of that incident was Tommy Mottola, who had managed John in the 80s, was now running Columbia, came down to hear the song and wanted power chords put into Your Life Is Now instead of passing chords. And when Andy made the statement about John, no passing chords rights, when John kind of went off, I think he was under a lot of pressure. So certainly if he was under that kind of pressure, he wasn't just knocking these out when he was half asleep. He was definitely driven on these records. And I still think there's a lot of great songs on those 90s records. I think that it would be a mistake, even on a record like Dance Naked, which probably is the worst of the 90s records. There's a great song on there called LUV. There's another one called Another Sunny Day. I think those are very good songs that stand up. Some of the other ones maybe are a little blah, but so even in his worst moments, they're still great stuff. Now, obviously, the records at the beginning of his career, when he was trying to figure out how to write songs and kind of growing up in public, weren't so great. I think even the most ardent John Mellencamp fan would not find a ton of redeeming qualities in those records. But really, from American Fool on, or there's even some good moments on Nothing Matters and the self-titled John Cougar album. I think you're going to be hard pressed to find too many singer-songwriters have delivered more A-list material over the last 40 years than John has. I guess another thing I want to talk about, I just mentioned George Green being the co-writer of Human Wheels. They wrote some songs together. They had a falling out to right around the time of the self-titled album or shortly thereafter. And then, they never really patched things up. And in 2011, 10 years ago, George passed away from lung cancer. Were you able to get any sort of enlightenment? There's really never been a great lineage of how John and George even wrote. Did they write in the same room? Did George write lyrics? John rewrote them. Did John write lyrics? George rewrote them, and then John set it to music. Did you get any sort of sense on that in talking to people throughout the book?
No, I think George is the great mystery figure in the book. I think he literally is one of those. He's the most you get. I think he was a nice guy. He was a lovely guy. That they worked well together when they worked. I think certainly early on, they would sit in George's on a couch in John's apartment at the time, knee to knee, and George would sketch out lyrics. I think George started writing the lyrics. He would send the lyrics to John. John would edit it, and they go backwards and forwards on that, and then John would set music to it. I think that's the way that it pretty much went all the way through. And the closest really I got to anything was there was a passing comment from John that it was like being married to someone, and like all marriages, there came a point when it didn't work anymore. I don't think John. I certainly haven't got any more or greater depth than that from John or anyone else. I don't think anybody else is really that clear. And if they are, they aren't saying on why that relationship fell apart. I think it's something that existed between the two of them.
But it sounds like they never spoke or reconciled again before George passed.
Nope.
Yeah, the one cool thing though, that George passed away, I think in August of 2011, and John went out for another leg of the No Better Than This tour, I think in October of 2011. And he added to his set list on that fall 2011 leg of the No Better Than This tour, a song called Circling Around the Moon, which George had written the lyrics for on Mr. Happy-Go-Lucky. And I think that was maybe George's favorite song they ever wrote together. So I think John kind of added that song to the set list as sort of a tribute to George. So that was a little bit of a nice grace note to end on there. Okay, so I know you don't have a ton of time, so I'm not going to just keep going through every little thing, but I think just sort of overall, maybe kind of a summation of this book, and I'll have a description or a link in the description to this video for people to be able to click and purchase it. It comes out September 14th in the United States, I believe September 20th in Europe. Just sort of your overall impressions and talking to people. I know we kind of talked about this earlier. Were there any stories you had in here that John saw that said, "Oh no, I don't want anybody knowing about this," that you had to take out, or was it just that one edit of the street that his grandma grew up on?
No, it was literally there was nothing in there that he asked to be taken out. He was he has read it. I think he's read it twice. So he was very much aware of it. He was. Sharon, who you mentioned, Sharon in Randy's office, and Kathy at Belmont Mall checked it over as well for facts. But there was nothing. There was no substantial take this out. I don't want that being said about me. So it is pretty much as everybody said it. I don't think there's anything that's been removed. Yeah,
and like I said, this really plays as like a career-spanning documentary, just the written version of it instead of the video version. So I think if you're a John Mellencamp, if you're just a rock music fan, this is a must-read book. It's very well done. I guess if you had to just kind of summarize John and what you learned about him through this, and you visited his house, it looks like twice in 2010 and 2011 or 2014 for the articles you wrote for magazines. Can you just kind of talk about what was John like in person when you did meet him those times? Was he gregarious and nice, and was he rough and demanding, or because it sounds like you flew on the plane with him to Bend, Oregon during the Bob Dylan summer tour in 2010. Can you just maybe a little lightning on those experiences beyond the actual articles, which I read both articles and thought they were great?
Thank you. That's part of it. I thought he was a fascinating character. When the first time I met him, I think I write in the book, he sort of, I was waiting on the properties, there's the house and the art studio, and they're separated by about a mile. And I was waiting outside the art studio. He drove up on a little John Deere tractor, and he got out looking about as much like John Mellencamp as anybody can look like John Mellencamp. But he'd got this Victorian walking cane, and he pulled out the top of it it was like a 3-foot long rapier blade that he started swishing around, and he stopped that in front of my face, told me I've got 60 minutes and no more, in so many words. And he definitely, I think the first impression that he gives you, I think, is he's quite intimidating, he's quite guarded. But I think once I sat down and started to talk to him, and it was clear, A, that I liked his music, and B, that I'd done a bit of research, and I was interested. He opened up and he was great. He was a brilliant interview, and I did sit on the plane with him. We flew up to the Dylan concert. He sat next to Mike Wanchit, and they were rattling on like family problems, people I knew were ill. If you recorded it, it'd have been gold, because it was brilliant. And it was a really, I thoroughly enjoyed. One of the best people I'd interviewed. But the second time I went to interview him was completely different. He met me with a big hug. We sat and talked for a couple of hours, and you got the sense I could ask him anything and he would give you an answer. And I think that's the thing with interviewing him. You do feel like whatever you ask him, he will give you an answer to it, and he'll give you a considered answer to it. And he's very, very bright, but he's really interesting. He's got one of those voices you could sit and listen to for hours. He's sort of this, obviously smoking 80 cigarettes a day has done something useful to his voice. Not that I'm advocating you do that, but he's just, like I said, I think he's just a fascinating character. I'm a massive Springsteen fan as well, and I've been fortunate enough to interview Springsteen, and I think there's so many similarities to it. But in both cases, the man lives up to what you hope and expect they are. I think they're both fascinating, interesting, determined, stubborn, cantankerous human beings, but they're what you want them to be, and there's a reason why they've existed for that long and why their careers have lasted that long. I think because they know exactly what they want to do, and they go whatever lengths it takes to do that. But I thought he was fabulous. I still do. I think he was brilliant.
And so I guess in your interviews with Springsteen, has he got some of the same sort of, harshness toward band members treatment that John has, or have you not gotten that much out of Bruce's side of things?
Bruce was, I spent, I interviewed Bruce over the course of 2 days. And it wasn't so much, it was more about, for the Bruce thing, that it was more about the fact that he'd suddenly started writing lots of, having spent years in between albums, painstakingly making records. He was back out with the E Street Band. I think it was what was the album after Magic? My brain is just
Working on a Dream.
Yeah, it was the Working on a Dream tour. Thank you, Mike. It was Working on a Dream tour, and it was more about where he was at that point in his life. I think if you read, is it Peter Ames Carlin's book, which is a really good book on Springsteen, a lot of the band members talk about their frustrations that, at one point he just called the E Street Band completely and went off in his own route. So I think they're both, they're both band leaders, and I think they can both be tough when they need to be tough. But this current band's been with John for years and years and years, so he might be difficult, but I also think there's a loyalty to him as well for people. Right. I think that people get something out of playing in John Mellencamp's band. It's not like, well, look at Mike Wonchik. It's not like people are leaving all the time. Andy York's been there a very, very long time, and the guys are in the band now. I think they'll tell you it's difficult, but there's an awful lot of respect for him as well in terms of who he is and what he does.
Right. Yeah. I think this whole band's been there at least since 98, 99. So over 20 years with the same band members, and which was another thing I guess I should have probably asked about. There was also a part in this book that during that self-titled album, John fired the band again, but then it sounds like the next day he invited them all back. So he was probably just blowing off steam, it sounds like, on that incident.
I think probably John's fired the band and lots of other people several times. I think by that point, they're probably all like, yeah, here we go again. So
I guess in summary, though, where do you kind of view John as, like songwriter all time? Is he a top 20 all-time American songwriter in your eyes? Is he, I don't know if he would get into the top 10, or because here in America he always seems to be underrated when they have these Rolling Stone magazine will have these top 500 lists and stuff, and he's almost never on any of them. They had actually the 100 best songwriters of all time a few years ago, and like the guy that wrote Britney Spears songs made the list and John didn't. It was frustrating. So where do you kind of put John as in the grand scheme of things, all-time songwriter, singer? What's your view of him and where he ranks?
I think he's right up there. I mean, I think Johnny Cash, Johnny Cash mentioned that he thought John was among America's greatest living songwriters.
Yeah.
And Johnny Cash is no fool, or was no fool when it came to that time. I think he is. I think he's among, if you sat down and you do a compilation of John's genuinely great songs, there's a lot of songs on that. There's an awful lot of songs on that list. I think he's right up there with the Springsteens, Pettys. I think he's in that group of people. And I think post Freedom's Road, arguably, he's made a clutch of just phenomenal record. I think Life, Death, Love and Freedom is my favorite Mellencamp album. I think it's right up there as one of the great American albums. So yeah, I think he's right up there with anybody you care to mention.
Yeah, and John, even in his box set On the Royal Rod, even said he thinks that's as good. Life, Death, Love and Freedom is as good as album as anybody's ever made, and he feels good that he can say that he made an album as good as anything that's out there. So it sounds like you're a big fan of these later records. I know you were a big fan of Plain Spoken. Do you have a list of maybe your top 5 albums or something? I think fans kind of eat these kind of lists up, or maybe your 5 or 10 favorite Mellencamp songs that you would mind sharing.
Well, I would say I think I reviewed Life, Death, Love and Freedom for Q, and at the time I gave it 3 stars, and I'd forgotten I'd done that. When I look back at that, I thought I must have had a really bad week when I was reviewing that record, because it's a phenomenal. So I think that's my favorite album by John. And then it gets really, it would change from day to day, but I would have in the list Scarecrow, because I played that album to death. It was all cassettes, so I must have gone through 15 cassette copies of that record. That would be in there. Freedom's Road would definitely be in there. Big Daddy, I love Big Daddy.
I do as well. Big Daddy's a great record.
amazing record. And then to try and pick a fifth is just like Lonesome Jubilee. I think Mr. Happy Go Lucky is his most underrated record. I love that record.
Yeah, and I think that would be one of his other 90s records he would actually have nice things to say about. I think there's some really great songs on that record. Go ahead.
As for the songs, oh dear. Minutes for Memories would definitely be in there.
That's a George Green one.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal song. Oh dear. Gina, I love Gina as a song. I think Gina's an amazing record, an amazing song. We mentioned Secular. I think What Kind of Man Am I is an absolutely unbelievable song.
That's from Ghost Brothers and then Made Sad Clowns. Yeah,
that's the phenomenal song. We Are the People, I'm a massive fan of. I love that song.
Yeah, he did that one on the last tour, and at the last in 2019 Farm Aid, he played that. That was great to see that come back out.
But if I had to pick one, and I think Human Wheels is just an awesome song, a phenomenally great song.
And you mentioned that in the book, that it would be on anybody's list of best Mellencamp songs. You mentioned that when you touched on Human Wheels in the book. Yeah,
phenomenal song. So I would have that, and also off. I think there's a couple. I think Martha Says and Jackie Brown off Big Daddy are both brilliant.
And Bob Guccione Jr., who you interviewed in the book, was a longtime fan of John's, wrote some articles on him back in the 80s and 90s when he was running Spin Magazine. He said that if Bob Dylan had written Jackie Brown, that it would have been considered one of the best songs ever written. But John wrote it, and it's just kind of under the radar in most people's lists. But it's, that's a fantastic song. And I would have to say songs like Longest Days, Save Some Time to Dream, A Ride Back Home, Blue Charlotte. I mean, these are some of the best songs he's ever written. And, that's all in the last 15 years worth of albums.
Yeah, Blue Charlotte's brilliant.
I think that's a great song. The melody, the lyrics, fantastic. Just that whole Plain Spoken album, I'm just enamored by all 10 songs. I think The Brass Ring, Sometimes There's God, Troubled Man. I mean, all fantastic pieces of work. And to do that this late in his career, I think John's kind of had an opposite career of a lot of people. A lot of people start with their, like an Elvis Costello or Bruce Springsteen. They start with their most brilliant albums at the beginning of their career, and then maybe toward the end their albums aren't so great. Elton John would be another one like that. John's kind of the opposite, where some of his best works come at the end, and the beginning of his career wasn't so great.
Well, it's interesting, like you mentioned, there's a new album coming out, and you are genuinely excited about hearing what he's done with the new album. And there's not many people that deep into a career where most artists of that age, you're interested. But I think he's perfectly capable when you hear the new record of it being the best record he's ever made, and that's something remarkable about that.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, were you able to get any insights into the new record from doing this? Do you have any song titles or what the sound of the record will be like in talking to people for this book?
I wish. All I know, I got a bit to it. One chick was talking about it a bit, and I've bits and bobs from Randy about it. I mean, I knew that Bruce was involved in it. I know it's been, as usual, they've been at Belmont Mall doing it. I think it's very much, from what I can gather in the line of what he's been doing, I don't think it's, he's not suddenly going to make a drum and bass record or go back to. No. I think it's very much in the line of, if you like Plain Spoken and life, that's what he's continuing to do. That's where he's going to be.
Yeah, he said that now his inspiration for songs is like John Steinbeck, Tennessee Williams, William Faulkner, the great American writers. I don't think you're going to have guitars blazing to be able to get those sort of sentiments across. So I think it's going to be more in that folk rock vein that he's been in lately, like you just said. But you said you're a big fan of Bruce. How excited are you to have John and Bruce collaborating on a few songs on this record? I think that everybody's very excited about that.
Well, that's going to be. I mean, I know Bruce has just done the Killers, and good luck to the Killers. But you'd imagine that John and Bruce is going to be something that would be out of this world. You'd imagine.
Right? Yeah, I just think it's cool that Bruce went to Belmont Mall to record. It's kind of like worlds colliding, and not only that, but it sounds like, I don't know any details, but it sounds like Bruce will be singing songs John wrote, or a song John wrote. I don't know the extent of how many songs they collaborated on. I think there was some guitar he played on some songs, and he sings on at least one. It sounded like, from the interview that Bruce had on E Street Radio on his Sirius Radio channel a couple months ago. So I think that everybody's very excited, and let's hope that they choose the Bruce John collaboration as the album's first single. I think that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, and then the tour. Hopefully, I mean, I hope he's actually going to bother to cross the Atlantic this time. But
yeah, that would be nice if he'd finally go back, so you guys could see him live at least one more time, right?
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Paul, I can't thank you enough. This book was absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
It's published on Simon and Schuster. I thank them. I think her name was Fallon. She set this interview up, and she was absolutely terrific to work with. I think that every John Mellencamp fan, every rock music fan, is going to love this book. Once again, there's a link in the description of where you can click and pre-order the book. It's released Tuesday, September 14th in the United States, and over in Europe, it'll be Monday, September 20th. I can't thank you enough, Paul. I could sit here and talk John Mellencamp with you all afternoon, but I know you got things to do, so I'll let you go. Thanks for your time, and let's hope this will be up on John's Facebook and YouTube pages, and so hopefully we'll get shed some light on this book and let people know that it's coming out. And I think I think this book will do very well. I think there hasn't been a really good John Mellencamp biography written since the mid '80s, a book written by a guy named Martin Torgoff. So this is long overdue. This will be like a 35-year update, and it's just the most revealing thing. There's a lot of stories in here I'd never heard. I'm a huge fan, so if I haven't heard of them, I know most other people probably haven't. And I think this is going to go down as one of the best rock biographies of 2021 for sure.
Thank you very much, Mike. Really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for all your time, Paul, and we'll be in touch. Take care.
You take care as well, mate, and anytime.
Okay, take care. Bye.